Today is going to be just a quick review of the neuron, action potential, and neurotransmission, which is all your Chapter 3A material. So the first objective is to know the parts and functions of a neuron. So remember our drawings in class. It starts with the dendrites. The dendrites are what bring the message into the neuron. The cell body is what kind of is the decision maker of that neuron. So remember that if a neuron receives more of an excitatory signal than an inhibitory signal, the cell body or soma will allow that neuron to fire. The message travels down the axon. Remember, the axon carries the message away from the cell body through the end of the neuron. That axon is covered in myelin sheath, which is a fatty substance which allows for speedy transmission of that message from one end to the next. Remember that destruction of myelin sheath is usually associated with the degenerative disease known as multiple sclerosis. Once it goes down the axon, it will go out the terminal branches of the axon, which are also known as terminal buttons or terminal buds. So remember that neurotransmitter would be released into a space between the two neurons, which is known as the synapse. So those are the basic parts of the neuron. Our next objective, so we'll come back to this slide in a second. Our next objective is to describe how action potential is created. Remember, action potential happens within a neuron. Neurotransmission is what happens between neurons. So you would not only have to know the parts of the neuron, but you have to know how they contribute to that process. So like I said, the dendrites bring the message in, so we've already talked about that. So these are the little dendrites. What happens is the different neurotransmitters would fit like a lock and key, meaning the neurotransmitter serotonin, for example, fits into the spot for serotonin, okay, the receptor for serotonin. So if this neuron were to receive enough of an excitatory signal, if these dendrites were to receive enough of an excitatory signal, it would cause that neuron to fire. Remember that the neuron has to reach what we call threshold in order for that neuron to fire. And once it fires, it's an all or none signal. So if this neuron decides to fire, it will fire at the same speed, the same strength, all of those things, regardless of how much of an excitatory signal it receives. So now going on to this slide, this just kind of walks you through. Remember that the axon sort of works like dominoes. When you talk about a neuron at rest, so the neuron that we were previously looking at, that neuron is in resting potential. We also call that polarized. Polarized is typically negative 70 millivolts. This means that the inside of the cell is more negative than the surrounding fluid on the outside of that neuron. So if the neuron were to fire, if it were to reach what we call action potential, that means that it's stimulated at or above the threshold. The cell then becomes depolarized, which usually is about positive 50 millivolts. So positively charged sodium ions will rush into the cell, and it will sort of push out the negative ions. This means that the neuron has fired. So again, how that works, it falls like dominoes. So positives rush in, and each segment, right? So this part of the segment is in action potential. This would still be, for our purposes, considered to be in resting potential. As it moves, as it's depolarized and it moves into the next section, those gates then will push out the positives and allow the negatives to take its place to get back to what's called resting potential. So when that neuron is trying to get balanced again or polarized again, we call that the refractory period. Remember that during the refractory period, the cell cannot fire again. So like a camera flashing, it has to recharge itself. So it's just a short period of time where it can't refire until it's back to its polarized state. And then notice it continues to move back down the axon the same way that, the first segment had fired. So then the positives are rushing in, they're taking the place, negatives are rushing out. So what we would call this, just for our basic purposes, if you think back to our drawings, while this is working, this is in the refractory period. This part is then in action potential. This part is still in resting potential, awaiting the message to travel. And then it continues to go down segment by segment. Okay. Remember that once that neuron is recharged, it can then start accepting signals again. So this process is known as action potential as it moves down the neuron. Keep in mind that this is both a chemical process and an electrical process. Within the neuron, it's an electrical process, right? Those ions are changing, the positives and the negatives are changing, but between neurons, that's where the chemicals are actually released into the synapse. When those chemicals are released into the synapse, right, those are our neurotransmitters that are released, they can then go act on the next neuron, which we'll talk about in a second as part of neurotransmission. Another part of the process of action potential is called reuptake. Remember that reuptake happens when the neurotransmitters are reabsorbed into the sending neuron and they're kind of repackaged to be used again the next time that that neuron fires. Okay? So as we look at neurotransmission itself, everything that I just talked about happens, all right? So the neuron fires, so we'll consider this the sending neuron. So action potential within a sending neuron happens. Neurons are not connected. There's a space between them called the synapse. The neurotransmitter is released into that space. It then will act on the dendrites of the receiving neuron. If that receiving neuron receives enough of the neurotransmitter to fire, remember, it fits like a lock and key. So the neurotransmitter that is meant for whatever the receptor is, that's the only thing that can go into that receptor site. We'll talk about things that can change that in a second. So if it receives enough of a signal to fire, the next neuron will fire, and that's how the message can kind of go throughout our body to get to our brains or to get to our central nervous system. Don't forget about reuptake, where the neurotransmitters then are reabsorbed for later use. So this is just kind of showing the neurotransmitter, the receptor sites of the receiving neuron, so what's being released, the space between, how the next neuron fires, and then reuptake, where the neurotransmitters are going back into the sending neuron to be used again later. Examples of neurotransmitters and their functions are listed here. Remember that you're going to want to know the basic function of the neurotransmitters, as well as what would happen if you didn't have enough of certain neurotransmitters or if you had too much of that neurotransmitter. You basically only need to know what's in your book. I would definitely know acetylcholine. I would know dopamine because that's a big one and kind of plays on our reward centers and things like that. Pretty much all of them that are listed here I would consider to be important. All right, like I said, our neurotransmitters will fit like a lock and key, but we have to remember the effect of drugs on neurotransmitters. And what we know is that drugs can act as both agonists and antagonists. Agonists are drugs that are so similar to a neurotransmitter that they mimic the effects of that neurotransmitter. So they typically work to excite the neuron. They can work by mimicking effects, or they can work by blocking reuptake. Remember that if we blocked reuptake, that would be similar to flooding the synapse between the two neurons, which also can cause feelings to occur. So an example, as it's listed here, would be morphine mimics the actions of endorphins, and therefore when you get morphine in a hospital or things like that, it can cause that same impact as endorphins, so that same pain-killing sort of euphoric high that you feel when you're on morphine. Another way that drugs can act on our neurotransmitters is to act as antagonists. Antagonists will inhibit a neurotransmitter to be released, so they can occupy the receptor site on the receiving neuron and block the neurotransmitter from binding and inhibit the neurotransmitter from being released. So that's pretty powerful as well. So remember in class I talked about using our keys, right? A social studies key is the only thing that'll open my door. Mr. Hull's key, a math key, will not work to open my door. However, if Miss Hammond brought up her key, then she would have what we would call an agonist. So something that's so similar to my key because it's a master key that it would unlock my door and it would work. So that would be an example of an agonist. If Mr. Hull tried to use his math key in my social studies door, that would be like an antagonist. Let's say his key got broken off in my lock and now nobody can kind of open that door. That would be similar to an antagonist. So it's blocking, it's taking up the site so that nothing else can work in that site. So these are the examples of the neuron, action potential, neurotransmission, neurotransmitters themselves, and then how drugs can play upon our neurotransmitters, so how they can kind of fake us out as agonists and antagonists. I'm just going to put up a few slides here so that you guys can test yourselves. I would pause the video as you read through the different questions. So just pause the video on each slide, because pretty much immediately following each slide, you're going to see the answers listed. So again, pause the video quick. Again, pause the video quick. Then pause the video. And this is our last slide. So pause the video again. As you look at the answers to these questions, hopefully you guys were able to get them right. These are just some basic general questions. Another thing just to kind of remember about the neurons are that the ones that we learn about are sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. Sensory neurons are the ones that bring in the message into the central nervous system. Interneurons hang out in the central nervous system, so they bring that message from the sensory nervous system. They decide if it needs to go to the brain or if it's in the spinal cord, and then from there, if any action was required, they would give it to the motor neurons to send back out. So sensory, inter, and motor are the three different types of neurons that you would need to know.